so we're out in the garage now, and I've gone ahead and got the car up on jack stands and got the rear wheels pulled off already. And I'm gonna, here in a second, pop my head underneath the car and talk about what bolts you're gonna need to take out to get off of the lower control arms on the rear end of the vehicle. It's pretty straightforward. You're gonna need a 17mm socket, a 14mm socket, and a 12mm socket. And then you're also gonna need a 17mm open-ended wrench to act as a backup on one of the bolts. Additionally, you're gonna need a floor jack to hold the lower control arm in place while you're driving out the outboard bolt connecting the lower control arm to the rear knuckle. And that's just to make removing the bolt a little easier to hold it in place, since it is under pressure, under tension from the spring being slightly compressed. And then you're also gonna need a flathead screwdriver, which I'll talk through to help getting one of the components out from this vehicle underneath as well. So let's go ahead and get under the car and we'll talk about what needs to get pulled off. Here at the front, or the outboard side of the lower control arms, you're going to take this 17mm head bolt out. On the front side of the control arm is an integrated nut. It's welded and it's a part of the control arm itself, so you do not need a backup on this bolt. It will just come out on its own. You're going to need to remove this, which is the bolt that would normally secure your end link for the rear sway bar. I actually don't even have that component installed in the vehicle right now. As I mentioned, I'm working on several suspension upgrades right now in tandem. So it's actually laying there on the floor. But normally you'll take this out, and on the front side is a welded nut, so you only have to turn this 12mm bolt and pull it out towards the rear. And then this bolt on the subframe connection of the lower control arm, the head of the bolt is a 14mm, and then the nut is a 17mm. The nut will come off easily, but then we have I don't know the proper term for it, but a washer here that is supposed to be retained in a little bracket in these subframes. And the way this is designed is it's actually threaded onto the bolt as well. So when you break this bolt loose and drive the nut off, the washer will stay more or less flush against the subframe here. So that's why I recommend a flathead screwdriver to, in essence, wedge in here between this little bracket on the subframe and the washer itself. So as you can see, it's oblong shaped, so it will want to rotate around as you're trying to take the bolt out. But if you can wedge a flathead in here and give it just a little pressure, you'll be able to hold that in place while you thread the bolt out from it. And once you get to that point, it's pretty easy. The subframe will, or the connections will just come right out. So the only other thing I'll mention is just keep track of where your springs are. You can see the little locating rubber plugs on the bottom of the spring cap. Once you take this bolt out, the spring's actually under a little bit of pressure or tension right now, so it'll want to expand. So it's where you're going to take the floor jack with a piece of wood on it to protect the paint and have it resting just on the bottom of this control arm while you take this bolt out. Once this bolt is free, you'll be able to drop the jack just a little bit, and that will relieve the pressure on this spring, and you'll be able to pull it out and just set it aside. So with that, I'll go ahead and set the camera up and we'll get to work pulling this control arm out. So when you get your floor jack on this outboard edge of the lower control arm, you want just enough pressure on it to make sure you capture it. You don't want enough force that you're actually lifting the car up off the jack stands. And now that the bolt is out, you can start to lower it. And you can see it didn't move much, but it did make pulling this bolt out a little bit easier, having the pressure on this to hold it in place. So I should mention the first thing you want to do is actually remove your end link for the sway bar. Like I said, I already had that out, which is why I started with this bolt in the rear knuckle. Now that the bolt's out, you can manually push the control arm down and go ahead and wiggle your spring out of here. Go ahead and set that to the side. Unfortunately, this bolt at the subframe connection to the lower control arm, the access to it is really not the greatest. I was not able to find any angle to get an impact on it, so I'm going to be using just regular hand tools. So like I mentioned, this is the one where you're going to need a 14 millimeter on the bolt on the head on the front side, and a 17 millimeter open-ended wrench to hold the nut on the back side. Now that that nut is out of the way, like I said, I'm going to try and get a screwdriver wedged up in here. And it'll take just a little bit of force. It's not the most ergonomic or comfortable position, but it's what I was able to do to get it done. You just need some way of holding this washer in place and be able to turn the hardware out. All right, and once that bolt's removed, control arm just drops right out. So this is a close-up of that washer. And as you can see, it's actually got some structure on the inside to grab and hold onto the threads of the bolt. So I don't know how well you were able to see it on camera, but I was basically getting a screwdriver wedged in on this side. So that way, as the washer wanted to rotate with the bolt, since it's oblong, it would end up kind of wedging itself into place, and that was allowed me to keep this stationary and work the bolt out. It is tedious, it's not very comfortable, and it's a little loud being able to hit the wrench on the exhaust and all of the subframe components, but once you start working it loose, it gets a little bit easier. Getting the first initial leverage on it is probably the most challenging, but now that these parts are out, we can work on getting the new components from RV6 installed into the car. All right, now we can take a look at the lower control arms from RV6 Performance, and these are gorgeous. That same very nice wrinkle red paint is applied all the way across them. I've got the RV6 Performance name plaque right here, which is gonna look really slick underneath the car if you stick your head underneath after it's installed. Now, a couple things to note before we get this in the car. For all intents and purposes, you are getting two identical lower control arms that go on the left and the right. You can install them on either side, but the intent is to have the RV6 Performance name plaque pointing towards the rear of the car. The reason I say they're identical, otherwise, is you have 3 holes here for your spring retention caps, so no matter which side that's on your car, they'll be able to line up with the way your OEM spring was originally installed. Just go ahead and try and get that placard towards the rear, and then utilize the same 2 spring retention caps that were on the respective side of the car. It should be the inboard and then the forward-facing cap. Otherwise, for me, the bar came shipped with the hardware installed, so I'm going to go ahead and remove all of that and set it to the side at first. Both this outboard and inboard nut are a 19 millimeter socket on the head and a 17 millimeter socket on the bolt. And then this guy, you will get a new bolt for your end link on your rear sway bar, and it's a 12 millimeter on the nut and a 6 millimeter internal hex bit. So one of these. When you go to install it back on the car, you're going to want to make sure the hardware is stacked just the same way it is here. So on the outboard side, you're going to want to make sure there's a washer present on both the nut end and the bolt head end. And then here at the heim joint, you have these new metal spacers on either end. And if I get close, let's look at this one. They are actually oblong. They've got a profile here on the inboard surface, and that's going to slot into the slot that's in your subframe down here. So I'll talk through that a little bit when we get there, but basically your heim joint's going to go, and the spacers go on the inside of your subframe, and then these 2 spacers help locate the joint. One goes on the front side and one goes on the rear side, and then you again will want to make sure there's a washer present between your bolt head and the spacer and the nut and the spacer. So I'm going to go ahead and get this hardware off and then get the camera set up, and we will start putting it into the car. All right, we're underneath the car, and I'm going to start getting this fished up into the subframe first. Okay, and this is where you can kind of see where this spacer comes into play. So I've got it seated on the front side already, but you basically want to make sure that you've got your slots inserted into the slot that was in this portion. So you'll kind of have to lift up and just hold everything in place while you get it seated and get the nut tightened on. So I'm gonna get the spacer in, get the washer on top of that, and get the nut on, and then I'm gonna tighten everything down enough so that as this bolt may move forward and reverse in the joint as I'm getting the rest of the parts all lined up, those spacers don't pop out of their position. Okay, so these nuts are lock nuts, and once you get it threaded down to just to where the first thread wants to protrude through the nut, you're not going to be able to do it by hands. So I've got a 19mm socket here on the front side, just holding the bolt steady, and I'm going to come in here with a 17mm and wrench and hold this in place. All right, so that's about hand tight. Like I said, you just want to make sure that there's not enough play to, as you wiggle this arm and get it into its final place, that you have a chance to knock those out, just to make sure everything stays lined up. Okay, and from this point, you can come in and get your floor jack in place. And set that about there. Okay, now that this lower control arm is kind of starting to get back in the position it needs to be, you can get your springs and come back in and get them loosely set on the face here. And you'll want to make sure you get the little protrusions in your lower spring cap nestled inside of the respective holes in your lower control arm. So for each side, it should be the inboard and the forward facing hole. So you basically just need to put just a firm bit of pressure right above those little protrusions, and they should slide right into the respective holes. And then after that, you'll want to make sure that you are centered on your point in the chassis to where that spring is going to ride against. So once your spring's all lined up, you can proceed with raising the jack here and getting your holes aligned in the outboard connection of the lower control arm with your bearing that's in the rear knuckle. So I have the solid bearings installed here, so you might see me manipulating these just a little bit to make sure that this face is square and parallel with the face on the lower control arm, just to get it to slide together. With the stock one, you shouldn't have that issue. It should just slide right up to begin with. One thing I did not mention is these lower control arms are set to the appropriate length, the same length as the stock lower control arm. So no length adjustment should be needed prior to assembly, and you'll just only fiddle with the adjustment after you get it all installed and going for your alignment. And make sure you got your washer in and just start threading your bolt in. Okay. And from this point, you would want to pivot your rear sway bar down and get your end links connected. Okay, we're doing the final steps on the rear sway bar now, and that involves getting the end links bolted into the lower control arms right here. So I've already got it done on the left-hand side of the car, and all that's left is to run the bolt through and secure the end link to the lower control arm here on the right side. One thing I noticed, and I'm not sure how much it matters that I have aftermarket lower control arms, or maybe there's something unique about my suspension, which is stock for the moment, but on the left side, I had to jack up the lower control arm to get the holes aligned vertically between the end link and the lower control arm. And I ran the bolt through and I dropped the jack and moved the jack over to the right side and assembled it here and tried to do the same, but I wasn't able to get the holes aligned in the same fashion. What I ended up having to do was get a second jack and lift up the lower control arm on the opposite side as well. So that helped bring everything back into enough alignment to where I could get the holes lined up here. So it was just a little bit of raising and lowering and adjusting on both sides of the car until I got the proper alignment needed. And once this is on the ground and the springs are compressed more, everything will be in a better position anyway. So I'm not terribly concerned about this, but just something to note. You may have to raise the lower control arms to get the holes aligned in these locations. So I'm gonna get my bolt put in, and then I'm gonna go through and do the final torques. Okay, now to wrap up the install on the lower control arms, or the camber arms, we're gonna go ahead and torque our bolts. So on the knuckle side bolt here, we've got 51 foot-pounds. On the subframe connection up here, we've got 85 foot-pounds. And on this bolt, I would say about 35 foot-pounds, be what you want.